And I'm going to introduce you to three new speakers, personalities. So joining us, we're going to have Magdalena Andersson, who is the governor of Västerbotten and chair of the Barents Regional Council. Welcome to you, Magdalena. Shirley Tagalik, who's from the Aviat Akumavik Society in Canada. She's smiling because I think I might have just mangled that a little bit. But anyway, welcome, Shirley. And Joel Clement, who is the Arctic Initiative Senior Fellow at Harvard Kennedy School, Belfer Center, that's all at Harvard University, and an expert on Arctic communities. So I'm delighted to see all five of you present and correct, and let us begin our conversation. And as ever, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to ask a few questions, but then the zingers are going to come from you lot. So I'm looking forward to taking a back seat and getting your questions. But I will begin, and I'll begin, if I may, with Magdalena. So you are a sort of local politician with local power. We had a fascinating exchange earlier with the Swedish Minister for Higher Education. I don't know if you were here for that, but I did. I just wanted to establish with her just what proportion of Sweden's population lived in the Arctic North, and I don't know if the minister's here at the moment, but anyway, we didn't quite get an answer. But somebody Googled it and then came and told me afterwards that it's around 3%. I think. Mm-hmm. Does that sound about right to you?
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah, good. All right, well, let's say it's 3%. So my question to you is, when we're talking about the future of Arctic communities, and in your case, Västerbotten and the Swedish Arctic, do you think that increasingly the regions have to take responsibility and be given more power for the economic and social development of their communities? Or can you trust the governments, often far away, the central governments, to deliver for you?
That's a tricky one. I think I have to correct you at the first, because I'm not a politician. I have been an MP before, but to be governor in Sweden is now a civil servant.
Okay, yes, sort of good. Well, that's important to say.
Yeah. So my task is to work for the government, no matter what political view they have. So it's quite tricky to say that the government in Västerbotten must say to the government in the whole Sweden how to do. But I think that most political parties, and I think I can say that because I have the experience, most of the political every political party has an aim to make things good for the northern part of Sweden, but they have different views of how to do it. What one party said that's most important, maybe it's number 3 of the 10 top for another party. And since you are a politician, you know that's how it works.
But the question, I suppose, partly is whether actually more of the decision-making power and the control over communities and people's lives should be vested in those communities themselves, i.e. much more autonomy be given than it currently is the case. Do you think more autonomy, more regional power is an important element here when we're talking about resilient northern communities?
Yes, we have parties that want that. Yeah, and they want. For example, there are parties that want that we have the water power that gives energy for whole of Sweden, and of course. Some say that in Sweden we have forest, in the northern of Sweden, forest, we have the water, and we have the minerals, and they say all the benefits of that should stay in the northern part of Sweden. Yeah, they say. But the rest of Sweden doesn't think so.
No. I mean, I'm just thinking you're being very careful. And now that I know that you're actually a civil servant rather than a politician, I can see that you have to tread quite a careful line. But where are you from yourself, personally?
I'm from the south of Sweden.
Oh, you're from the south of Sweden.
Yes.
Ah, interesting.
Yes.
I mean, do you think the people of Västerbotten, does it bother them that you're a southerner who's now sort of...
No, I don't think so.
You don't think so?
No, I don't think so. Hopefully.
Well, it's interesting.
Well, yes, because I have had this work now for almost 8 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was appointed by the last government and was have had to prolonging by the present government. So two different governments.
You're probably doing something right in that case, but nonetheless, it is interesting that you're an outsider now focused on the well-being of a community in the far north. I'm going to leave it there for just a moment, Magdalena. Shirley, I want to bring you in.
Okay.
You say that with some reluctance. You, if I may say so, have great experience working in indigenous communities in the north of Canada. I'm right, aren't I?
Yes.
Yes. So, be as open as you can with me. Do you believe that the voices of indigenous peoples in Canada are properly heard, and not just heard, but listened to and responded to when it comes to decisions about the economic, the social futures of these communities?
I'd have to start by providing some context. So I'm very specifically from a Nunavut community,
right.
And the indigenous perspectives in our vast country are significantly different. Yeah. Having said that, Inuit across Canada and actually circumpolarly share a very specific set of beliefs and ways of being, and so I think central to that is their need to revitalize their rights and their language and their culture in terms of everything that's happening in their territories. I've worked extensively with elders in the 45 years I've been in the North, and elders said, everything is about inusik. It's about social development. It's about who we are as a culture, as a people. You have to understand that everything that we are depended entirely on silatavut, our environment. Any resource that we had came from our environment. And so the relationship between people and the environment is very specific and very detailed and very well defined. And then mitigating that is ikakaukawingnak, the innovation and the technology that we bring to those resources and turn them into something that will improve our society. So when they talk about knowledge, they say you can be an expert, you can be terribly skilled, you can know what there is to know on a topic. But for Inuit, it is not knowledge unless you take that information and you translate it into something that improves the lives of the people around you.
Well, that is very interesting, and I'm fascinated by this traditional respect for and paramount place for the knowledge of elders. Because it just strikes me that everything about Arctic Frontiers 2020 is about the degree to which we need to be listening to the science, we need to be looking at new technologies, new economic opportunities that come with the new ideas, and also we're looking at a very changed climate where a lot of the history of the balance between man and nature in the north is being rewritten year by year because of climate change. So I suppose my question is whether the elders can in the future be the source of sort of authority, social and even economic authority, that they've been in the past, when they can't tap into this new and very changed world?
Well, they can tap into it, and part of that Inuit perspective is that the reason Inuit survived is because they have always been adaptive to whatever's been going on in their environment. So adaptation and resiliency are part of culture. And they're part of the way they define knowledge and the way they use knowledge to improve their context.
So would you argue that the scale of change we're in the midst of now, both climatic and technological, doesn't override that ability to adapt that you're talking about from the past, that they will adapt,
yes,
even in these conditions?
Yes, and I think the big concern that we all have in our communities is that we need to make sure that our youth have the same training and the same access to skills and knowledge, cultural knowledge that generations before them had, so that they can move forward in those adaptations with, competence and capacity. And with colonization, that's the piece that's been broken in our communities. So if we're talking about successful, sustainable social development, in our communities, we're talking about revitalizing language, culture, the role of elders, the understanding of knowledge as sustainable and creative ways of building strength in communities.
Interesting. So we've had two really interesting perspectives. One from a senior civil servant governor whose purview is the north, but is actually from the south, and then you saying, so much knowledge rests in the indigenous communities and their elders in particular, and that needs to be respected because it can adapt to change. So Joel, I want to bring you in because you, correct me if I'm wrong, but you were a key architect of a report written in 2016, I think, called the Arctic Resilience Report. So it's very much across the issues we're dealing with today about communities and the future for communities in the Arctic. So what would your overview be of what matters most to ensuring that Arctic communities are resilient looking forwards?
Well, thanks for asking that, because I really like this back and forth right now. I tend to be, first let me say I'm delighted to be back here at Frontiers.
Well, we're delighted to have you.
Thank you. After a period of exile, I'm back in the game. The question of this bottom-up or top-down question is riveting, and one of the primary findings from that resilience report is that while the ideas and innovation and leadership can, should, and often does come from local communities, particularly indigenous leaders who have a relationship with place and time and change that surpasses that of any other people on Earth. The problem is that the change is happening too fast. At this point, no one's off the hook in terms of making resilience work. And the number one finding of this report was that local empowerment is the most important factor for making resilience work. That means that governments at all scales need to take off the handcuffs in a lot of ways. There are a lot of constraints on resilience that are not thought of that way. There are laws and processes and planning processes, consultation rules that are in place that don't work that well, and in often ways constrain resilience. So on one hand, the governance needs to come from above. That needs to be fixed, and then those handcuffs need to come off. But the big constraint we always run into when we talk about resilience is that we can have all these great ideas. They can come from the bottom or the top, but no one's putting money into that.
Right.
So it comes down to that investment question, and that's where the rest of civil society, I think, can engage, right? Is we need to stop wondering and being vexed about where the money's going to come from and start experimenting and moving money forward. And we're having conversations here with a lot of people about ways to do that. We can talk about that more throughout this conversation. But I do think that's when the dam breaks. That's when you start to see projects in place.
That strikes me as very interesting. And Aileen, I want to bring you in here because obviously you have, as you so clearly said in your opening remarks, you have a lot of remote communities in the north of Scotland, on islands, but also in the Highlands, which, is a huge area. And this money question is interesting. You're a government of all the people of Scotland, and if you are to sort of invest in transport infrastructure, in high-tech infrastructure, everything from Wi-Fi to sort of high-tech industry, and if you are to try to put as much of that resource as you possibly can into the remote and the northern parts of your country, per capita, you're going to be spending much more than you would be to do, offer similar things to people in central Glasgow or Edinburgh. Is there the general sort of consensus in Scotland to do that, to spend more to ensure that the right kind of funding gets to your underpopulated remote communities? Because that would be interesting for other Arctic countries to hear, whether there's a general buy-in to that.
So I think there's a number of things that are happening at the moment in Scotland. We just passed legislation to create a national investment bank. So that's just kind of to make sure that we've got infrastructure mission, that we don't just think about it in economic terms, but we have to think around the social impact as well. That's why we're taking forward and being active members within the group of communities and countries that are looking to focus more on well-being. But the investment is vexing for us in government. We have finite resources, but we need to then make sure that we maximise the use of that resource. And that's why we've also been thinking about things on the basis of place. We've got the place standard that has been internationally lauded, where we don't just think about this is a road that's going to lead to a particular town, but it's actually how do you make sure then you've got the housing round about it, you've got economic opportunity, that you've got jobs. We've got some of that happening in the likes of Fort William, where there's going to be really economic opportunity, employment opportunity. But to unlock that, we need to have housing and infrastructure around about that to make sure that everyone feels the benefit of it. So there is absolutely a kind of commitment to make sure investment goes into the places that have fewer people.
Even if it is relatively very expensive to do it.
Well, we already currently do that. We already do link up our country. We have boats going up to Shetland, and we have boats going to Orkney, to the Western Isles. We have a regional economic partnership down in the south of the country, because while we have lots of sparsely populated places in the Highlands, we've also got an area in the south of the country which has felt that it hasn't had the attention that is required. If you come into Scotland from wherever you stay in London or whatever, you come into Scotland up the M74 and you're up and out without recognising that you can come to the southwest or the southeast. So there has been a real lack of attention and focus, and that's why we have emulating the success of Highlands and Islands Enterprise, which for decades has not only just focused in on economic enterprise, but the social element of it. We're also replicating that for the south of the country with investment alongside it, to make sure that those communities there can feel that they are being listened to, being engaged with, and that they have the right and deserve to have access to the services that other parts of the country enjoy. But it's not just also about remote countries. We've also got some areas in really high populated parts of the country that are feeling much a big sense of poverty.
Yeah,
there is underinvestment as well, and it's about how we do all of those things.
And it's about choices and prioritisation.
But I think the key principle is listening to the communities themselves and working with, not doing to, which is exactly the point I think I would agree with the two previous speakers, because sometimes it's us in government that is the barrier, it's us that's the problem, it's the rules that we've created, and that can be the same for local government as well. And that's why amongst all that, we're thinking about how do we rebalance governance in Scotland in terms of how do we empower our local governments, how do we empower our communities, but not just thinking about it in terms of elected representatives. There's a huge amount of investment goes into the health service that have a huge impact on our communities, but don't necessarily have those democratic structures or those the input from our communities in the way that they might do to a local government or to national government. So there's real opportunity, there's real challenge, but we commissioned a report in nearly 10 years ago, a trade unionist Campbell Christie, who came forward with a set of recommendations that basically challenged us that we have to work in partnership, we have to work across portfolios, we have to disregard professional boundaries and portfolio boundaries, focus in on people, work with our people in our communities to maximise the resources that we have. And I think then that then enables us to then start to get to some of the nub of the question that you asked me.
Yeah. And I just want to bring you in, Michael, and I'm going to go to questions from everybody else. But it strikes me, the picture you painted of your extraordinary territory is kind of mind-blowing to many of us. But underpinning a lot of the debate here at Arctic Frontiers is the constant tension between wanting to protect nature, wanting to recognize the realities of climate change, and that the Arctic is very much involved in climate change, both as the sort of victim of what is happening to the planet, but also potentially because of its vast fossil fuel resources as, you know, a contributor to furthering the problem. So here's my question for you. For the people of your Sakha communities in the Arctic who sit upon vast, untapped fossil fuel resources, is it seen as entirely, you know, for them to decide how and when and, you know, in what manner those resources are exploited? Or is that inevitably going to be a decision taken from Moscow that will be imposed upon the peoples of your communities, and frankly, you know, they'll have very little say in how it's done? How is that going to work?
Well, I would answer to this that in Russia we have the system is that we have joint obligations, the regional government and federal government. So, of course, we have challenges related to extractive industries, how they have to operate in our region. But we also understand that we have to develop our region. We have to improve the quality of life. And we try to find the best ways to do it in more sustainable and engage regional and local communities to this process.
But to be specific, I think you said you're from your people are reindeer herders,
yes.
right?
Yep.
So the building of gas pipelines across tracts of territory is not good for the herders nor for the reindeer.
It's loss of pastures.
Right. So the question comes when we're talking about resilient communities and the future, particularly of indigenous peoples. You know, how much influence will the interests of the reindeer herders have in the decision-making process on new pipelines, new fossil fuel projects?
Well, it's challenging, of course, challenging question, because, of course, the impact of industrial development to indigenous community is, in some areas, it's also different. For example, in Arctic districts, today it's not so big impact, but in southern part, where we have more developed mining industries, impact is bigger. So, of course, resilience is dependent on this impact, and if the impact is so big and so profound, then it decreases the resilience of the community, of course. But we try to, as I said, find the ways how to deal with this challenge. We cannot stop development, of course. We understand that we need to develop also economy, but we're trying to find ways. For example, I was in my speech talking about different tools, how we do it. Ethnological expert review, traditional territories where it's special regime to use this land for any other industrial development. So we try to keep the reindeer herding as a main livelihood for indigenous people, and at the same time, we have many conflicts when it comes, but we try to
put it this way,
put all the interests.
Okay, I don't mean to be challenging you too much, but I'm very interested in this. I don't know if do you have kids?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. What are they? I mean, you're a young guy, so they're probably not doing jobs yet. They're probably still at
9 months.
Yeah, 9 months. I'm speaking as an old guy. I have kids who are much more than 9 months. Okay, forget your children. But anyway, the point is, do you regard it as a success? Let's say that your, wider family, that people who used to be involved in traditional lifestyles and reindeer herding and other long-term indigenous sort of economic activity, they get jobs in the fossil fuel industries. They work for a big. Well, is that natural evolution? Is that a good thing, or is that something that's threatening the does that represent resilience or the opposite of resilience? If young people are abandoning the traditional ways and signing up to a big oil company or whatever.
Well, this is exactly the challenge that young people today, it's difficult for young people to continue traditional livelihood because of globalization, because of they have to take education. But when they go, for example, to take education, usually it's difficult for them to turn back to their community. And but also, if all our young people will go and work in the oil companies, I don't think that we will preserve the people as people, with their culture, with language, etc. So, and many young people, they cannot find themselves in the mainstream society. They would like to continue reindeer herding, but it's a challenge. So,
so I think we need to define what we mean by resilience as well. But I'm going to stop chuntering myself and invite questions from all of you, who I'm sure bring many different perspectives to this issue, this topic. So do feel free to raise a hand, and we'll get you involved. I'll start over there, then I'll come down here. But yes, microphone. Can we have the microphone over there? Because I'm very. Oh, you're determined to go there, are you? I thought we would start on the side and then come to the middle, because the sides sometimes feel neglected, and I don't want to neglect the sides. Ma'am, over to you.
Hi, thank you. I'm Anna, University of Edinburgh. Thank you for the very interesting discussion and sort of following on the dialogue about globalization. I just have a question to everyone in the panel, but specifically to Michael. So it's been mentioned multiple times that preserving indigenous cultures and specifically languages is a massive challenge. But do you have any practical advice, a vision of how to actually address this challenge?
Any practical advice on how to preserve language, tradition in the face of all of this change?
Yeah, I think that language is preserved where it's used. So if we will manage to preserve traditional livelihood, like, for example, reindeer herding, then we can have a chance to preserve the language. And also, of course, education is very important. Very often education is used as a tool for assimilation, unfortunately. It's very important to educate young people, but it should be also in their own language and about things that are important for these people. The education should be relevant to indigenous.
It strikes me that the question of young people and respecting their needs, their interests, their long-term futures is absolutely crucial to this issue of resiliency. I just wonder if you've got any thoughts on that, Shirley.
One of my jobs as an educator was to, when Nunavut was formed, was to redesign the education system around Inuit Kayumayaktukangit, or Inuit belief. And our expectation was that our education would be delivered according to Inuit cultural belief, and it could be delivered in Inuit languages. As a curriculum developer, it was entirely possible. It hasn't been implemented, but it was entirely possible. Where it was implemented, we found young people just rose up and embraced the coursework that they were being given. And just to an earlier point, I have a daughter who works in the mining industry. She works 2 weeks in the mine, she comes out for 2 weeks, and she designs Inuit-inspired clothing.
Right.
She's currently in New York at a fashion show where she's designing parkas for, Canada Goose parkas.
Right.
So there are all kinds of opportunities for our youth to be able to bridge both. And I think that is where the real resiliency comes.
So the rise of one doesn't have to be the death of the other.
Not at all.
Well, that's a really important point to hang on to. Ma'am, I know you wanted to have a word. So let's come to, if we bring the microphone this way now, let's do that.
Well, thank the panel for a really interesting discussion, and a question maybe to Misha and also to Shirley on the point of survival. It's a difference between surviving as single human beings and to survive as distinct peoples, cultures, languages. I think we have to recognize this discussion. Did I get your point, Misha, on that? And also a question to maybe all the panelists. We are talking about resilience and the possibility to adapt to the rapid changes in the world. But isn't it so that to be able to fast adaptation, you have to have a minimum of self-determination? You have to have some fate control to be able to adapt. And isn't this crucial when it comes to indigenous peoples in the Arctic?
Well, that second point was something at the beginning of our discussion when we were talking about autonomy and the degree of power that is invested in local communities. Something we've talked about to a certain extent. I don't know if anybody else, Joel, I don't know whether you have thoughts on the degree to which autonomy is a key to this.
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, that is often the number one indicator of resilience, is that fate control or empowerment and the degree of empowerment, but also as is the diversity of voices within the community. And that's why I think this youth issue is very important, and also women, and making sure that women and youth have strong voices as well. That's a form of empowerment that goes beyond the usual, give us the room to operate, but also within communities. That can really be a great indicator of success. Potential success.
Well, I do agree about that. I think to give empowerment for the people who lives in an area, to have them to stay in the area, to go back to the area and to live in the area, it's a lot of things that you have to work on, and gender is one of the absolute most important issues, I believe, because young women tend to leave the sparsely populated areas and go to university and then maybe not come back. And the young men are staying there, not so much educated as the women. So I think the municipalities have to really consider, how are we going to make young women to want to stay? Because if they want to stay, or if they want to come back after education, that will make the whole municipality or the society to...
So give me a couple of ideas, practical things that can be done to make staying or returning to these communities more attractive for young women in particular.
I think you have to ask the young women.
Well, fair point.
What do you want? What is missing? Because if we don't ask them, you can make a table with a lot of experiences or whatever, but if it doesn't suit.
Well, are there any young women in the audience who, for whom this conversation is relevant because of where they're from or where they live, who feel like contributing, telling us the lights have gone out. That's scary, isn't it? But is there anybody, any? It doesn't have to be a young woman; it could be a young man. But hang on, we've got a female hand up here. Do tell us your situation, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Sigrid. I work at Norwegian Polar Institute. But this comment will be like from a general young woman. I know that in Norway there's a large discussion on hospitals. So one very important thing for young women when we settle down is to be able to give children in a very safe way. That's one thing. But you also need schools. You need resilient societies with possibilities where you can use your education and shape your own future and shape your society. And many want to give a lot back to their home community.
So you literally need investment in everything from maternity hospitals through schooling, from preschool through school to jobs, all of which have to, offer something to young people, but particularly in this case, we're talking about young women.
Well, I met exactly that young lady yesterday at the restaurant. She was serving us at the table. She was a student at the university here in Tromsø, 2 years now, and she was going to be a doctor. And she told us that after I'm finished with my studies, I want to go somewhere else in Norway or Sweden or anywhere for a few years, and then I will come back. Why do you want to come back, they asked. Yes, because Tromsø is a good place to live in, because it's good to have children here. We have good education here, we have a very good university, and we have good childcare. And so she was the perfect one. And if young women think like that, they will return.
I just want to end with a thought that we haven't really touched on, but it just strikes me as interesting. If we're talking about the resiliency, because this whole conversation has been about people, we're going to talk more about infrastructure, industry and tech in a second session, but if we're talking about people and the resiliency of communities in the far north, how much concern does there need to be about the demographic balance between incomers, people who have literally just come because there's a high-paid job in the exploration industries or a high-tech startup or something, so they've come from far away, they are genuinely outsiders, and those who can call themselves indigenous people. The far north is crying out for more labor. In Norway, northern Norway, for example, there are loads of jobs, not enough people to fill the jobs. So if the trends continue, more and more outsiders will come up to the north, but a lot of the insiders, the indigenous, will leave to go elsewhere to study and might not come back. Does that balance between outside and insiders within the north matter?
Oh yeah, of course.
And is it going in a worrying direction?
Well, from the resilience perspective, if your goal is long-term resilience, you're not welcoming in extractive boom and bust economies, right? You don't want that.
Right.
It's not good for either your community or the longevity of the people there. So that creates an automatic tension there between people that are coming in to work in those industries.
Because their mindset is essentially transient, and also their interests are different.
Yeah, it has a negative effect on resilience unless there's an immense amount of respect about who is from there, who is hosting them, and what is it they're working toward there. Yeah.
And if I could just add, in our communities, it's all about community. It's the collective, way over the individual. And so if you begin to develop a community where there are transients, not committed, people in the community who ghettoize themselves and are not part of that collective, then it completely shifts the dynamics in the community. And I would say that has a really negative effect, both on resilience and on self-determination.
Right. Aileen, I'm going to give you started, and I'm going to give you the last word because we're out of time, but I can tell you wanted to get in there, so go on.
Yeah, sorry, there's a number of things I wanted to come back on in terms of the last question as well, but I think, our population's declining. We need to have people coming in and working and contributing, and I think some of the tensions we've found, for instance, in places like the Highlands, has been the affordability of housing, and sometimes people coming into the community and house prices going up, prices going up. So that means then, from our perspective, we need to make sure that we've got affordable housing, investment, proper investment into housing, social rent, and affordable more generally. But I think, to wrap up that last point with this one, is about how we engage with people and at what point in policy making do we engage with them, because I think you're right, we can tick a box at some point and say we've engaged and consulted, but does that fundamentally change the approach? And the book I would recommend to everyone is Invisible Women, and I suppose that females haven't been involved in the decision making, and that therefore over generations the gap in data knowledge about women's needs, for instance maternity care, means that poor decisions are made that don't meet the needs of women, and then has an impact in terms of where women live or where they choose to be. And I think that's the same for lots of different communities of interest. We need to properly engage, and I can give you an example of where the Scottish Government has engaged with people who've experienced poverty in the setting up of our Social Security Agency, engaged with people to find out what do they need from our Social Security Agency and how benefits are paid to them, most vulnerable people who don't often get engaged with at all in policy making. And we've now adapted and created a new system that really does meet their needs. For example, even small details like issuing letters out in white envelopes, as opposed to what we know is people getting things in brown envelopes, burying their head in the sand and getting into debt because they just are too frightened, life is too chaotic to even begin to want to open those envelopes. Right. So that's a small example, but these are the things that are important to people, and when you engage meaningfully, not in a tokenistic way and beyond just the initial consultation moment, that you can make sure that your policy decisions you take at a national level, local level, can have impact and benefit the communities you're wanting to serve. We're going through a local governance review. The other thing I would just say is we can't assume what local empowerment looks like, and it will be different. What we know, it will be different in every community. Lots of communities will want lots of different things. That's a challenge for us as policymakers and decision takers in government, but nonetheless we need to step up and meet that, because for too long a lot of communities have been resilient in spite of government, and that's something that we need to shift. And it means that we need to be a bit brave. We need to be a government then that kind of accepts when things don't go well or doesn't go right, and actually just learn from that and trust our communities, because they're the ones ultimately that know best.
Yeah, well, trust our communities is probably a great way to end this particular session. It's been fascinating to draw in experience and perspective from very different parts of the North. And I've really enjoyed it because I think it is about doing the best by the people who live in Arctic communities. So I notice it says here a 30-minute stretch. We've slightly overrun, so it might be a 25-minute stretch at most. So go and stretch quick. But before you do, please give a big thank you to this panel. Thank you very much, panel. Thank you. And I'll see you soon. Thank you.